Good evening, I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger. I was wrong. Tonight's story is about a woman removed from a flight for doing exactly the job she was trained to do, and the report that followed her off that aircraft and straight into a federal investigation. This is the story of Flight 1163. Dr. Naomi Ferris settled into seat 24C on a Tuesday morning flight from Seattle to Chicago, a small leather notebook already open on her tray table before the aircraft had even finished boarding. She was 36, dressed plainly in a gray blazer over a simple blouse, reading glasses pushed up into short natural hair, her carry-on stowed neatly overhead alongside a hard-shell case she'd handled with obvious care during boarding. She was an aerospace structural engineer, 12 years into a career that had taken her through 2 major manufacturers, and for the past 3 years, into independent consulting work, the kind of specialized, highly technical contract work that airlines and regulators quietly relied on to catch problems before they became disasters. Work that almost never made headlines, because when it was done well, nothing happened at all. She wasn't flying for pleasure. She was 3 days into a discreet consulting engagement, retained by a regional aviation safety nonprofit to review passenger-reported anomalies across several routes operated by Continental Sky Airlines, reports of unusual vibration during specific phases of flight on a particular subfleet of aircraft, reports that had been filed and, according to the airline's own public safety disclosures, fully investigated and resolved months earlier. Naomi's early findings suggested otherwise. She'd flown this exact route twice already that week, each time documenting careful, methodical notes, timestamps, altitude readings cross-referenced with her own instrumentation app, brief descriptions of vibration patterns she felt through the airframe during specific portions of climb and cruise. It was tedious, unglamorous work, the kind that required patience and precision rather than drama, and she was good at it precisely because she'd trained herself, over more than a decade, to notice what other people's bodies simply filtered out as ordinary flight sensation. 20 minutes into the flight, as the aircraft settled into its climb, she felt it again, the same faint, irregular vibration she'd documented on her 2 previous flights, concentrated somewhere in the wing root structure, subtle enough that most passengers would never register it consciously, but unmistakable to someone who'd spent years learning exactly what an airframe should and shouldn't feel like under load. She opened her notebook and began writing, quickly, precisely, the way she always did. Timestamp, altitude estimate, description, comparison to prior observations. A flight attendant named Bridget Coyle noticed Naomi's focused note-taking during a routine cabin walkthrough. Glancing at the open notebook, the small handheld device Naomi occasionally checked, the hard shell case now open slightly at her feet, containing what looked, to an untrained eye, like unfamiliar electronic equipment. Bridget didn't ask Naomi directly what she was doing. Instead, she made her way to the forward galley and mentioned it to the lead flight attendant, a man named Chris Dunbar, in the particular tone people use when they've decided something is worth flagging without being entirely sure why. "There's a passenger in 24C, Bridget said. She's been writing notes this whole flight, checking some kind of device, and she's got equipment in a case at her feet. It's giving me a weird feeling." Chris relayed the concern to the cockpit during a routine check-in, more as a courtesy than an urgent alert, describing what Bridget had described to him. The captain, a man named Gary Holloway, 51 years old, 20 years with the airline, listened to the description and made a decision that would define the rest of the flight. "Have her escorted back to the galley for a conversation," Gary said. "I want eyes on that equipment before we're an hour into this flight." Chris approached Naomi's row a few minutes later, his tone carefully neutral but unmistakably official. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me for a moment, please." Naomi looked up, closing her notebook automatically, the reflexive caution of someone used to being asked questions about her work. "Is there a problem?" "Just a routine check. If you could bring your bag." Naomi gathered her things, glancing at the passengers around her, several of whom had turned to watch, the particular attention a cabin pays when someone is asked to leave their seat mid-flight. She followed Chris to the forward galley, where Captain Holloway had stepped briefly out of the cockpit, his expression carrying the specific gravity of a man who believed he was handling something serious. "Ma'am, can you explain what you've been doing for the past 20 minutes?" Gary asked. "I've been taking notes on flight conditions," Naomi said, keeping her voice level despite the tightening in her chest, the familiar, exhausting recognition of a situation she'd navigated more times in her career than she cared to count. "I'm an aerospace engineer. I'm consulting on a safety review for this route. Do you have identification confirming that? I have a business card, a consulting agreement summary on my phone, and I'm happy to explain exactly what I'm documenting if that would help." "What's in the case?" "A calibrated vibration sensor and a laptop. I use them to supplement what I can observe manually." None of it is dangerous. I can show you. Gary studied her for a long moment, the kind of assessment that had nothing to do with the actual content of her answers, and everything to do with an instinct he wasn't examining closely enough to notice its own shape. I appreciate the explanation, but given the circumstances, I've made the decision that we're going to divert to the nearest suitable airport and have you deplane there. I'm not comfortable continuing with unidentified equipment on board that a crew member flagged as suspicious. Naomi felt something cold settle in her stomach, the specific dread of watching a reasonable explanation fail to matter against a decision someone had already made before she'd finished speaking. Captain, I've shown you my identification. I've explained my equipment. I've offered to demonstrate exactly what it does. I'm not sure what more you're asking for. I understand this is frustrating, Gary said, in a tone that suggested he understood nothing of the sort. But as captain, the final safety decision on this aircraft is mine, and I'd rather be cautious than not. There's nothing to be cautious about, Naomi said, her composure straining now, though she kept her voice controlled. I'm a licensed engineer conducting a legitimate safety assessment. If anything, what I'm documenting should concern you far more than my notebook does. What do you mean by that? Naomi hesitated, weighing whether to say more, then decided the moment called for honesty, regardless of how it landed. I've felt an irregular vibration in the wing root area on this exact route twice before this week. I believe it's the same issue behind several passenger complaints filed against this aircraft type over the past several months, complaints your airline's public disclosures describe as resolved. I don't believe they were actually resolved. That's what I'm documenting. The galley went quiet. Gary's expression shifted, uncertainty flickering behind the authority he'd been projecting a moment earlier, though it didn't visibly change his decision. That's a serious allegation, he said finally. One more reason I want this handled on the ground rather than in the air. 40 minutes later, Flight 1163 diverted to Denver International, an announcement citing an unspecified, operational matter that left the rest of the cabin murmuring in confusion. Naomi was escorted off the aircraft upon landing by airport police, who, after reviewing her identification and consulting agreement documents on the tarmac, released her within 20 minutes without charges, the responding officer visibly unimpressed by the circumstances that had prompted the call. But by then, the diversion itself had already cost the airline nearly 3 hours in delayed connections, rebooked passengers, and a fuel dump that alone had run into 5 figures. Consequences Gary Holloway hadn't fully weighed in the moment he'd made his decision. Consequences that would matter considerably more once certain other facts came to light. Naomi didn't go home angry, exactly, though the humiliation of being escorted off an aircraft in front of 140 strangers sat with her the rest of that day in a way she couldn't fully shake. What she did instead was finish the job she'd actually been hired to do. She compiled her findings that evening, 3 flights worth of vibration data, cross-referenced against Continental Sky's own maintenance logs, which she'd been granted limited access to as part of her consulting agreement, and against the FAA's public database of prior passenger complaints on the same aircraft subfleet. What emerged, once she laid it all out methodically, was not an isolated anomaly, but a documented pattern spanning 11 months, a specific wing attachment fitting on a particular variant of aircraft that Continental Sky had quietly flagged internally, issued a limited inspection bulletin for, and then, according to Naomi's data, never actually completed inspections on more than a third of the affected fleet before marking the issue closed in its public safety disclosures. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was, as these things almost always turned out to be, a slow accumulation of deferred maintenance, understaffed inspection teams, and a corporate reporting culture that had learned to describe mostly handled as fully resolved, because the gap between those two phrases rarely got checked closely by anyone with the expertise to notice. Naomi submitted her formal report to the safety nonprofit that had retained her, and, per the terms of her consulting agreement, to the FAA's Aviation Safety Reporting System simultaneously. She included, in a section she debated including for nearly an hour before deciding it mattered, a detailed account of her removal from Flight 1163, not as a personal grievance, but as a factual data point, illustrating how the very act of documenting the problem had triggered resistance from within the airline's own operational culture. The FAA's response came faster than Naomi had expected. Within a week, an emergency airworthiness directive was issued for the specific aircraft variant she'd flagged, mandating immediate inspection of the wing attachment fitting across the entire affected subfleet, 19 aircraft grounded simultaneously across Continental Sky's network while inspections were completed, a disruption that made national news within days, though the coverage focused almost entirely on the grounding itself rather than the woman whose data had triggered it. Inspectors confirmed measurable fatigue cracking consistent with Naomi's vibration data on 6 of the 19 aircraft. Cracking that, left unaddressed, aviation engineers later testified in a subsequent congressional hearing, could plausibly have progressed to a structural failure within an estimated 18 to 36 additional months of continued service under normal flight loads. Continental Sky's chief operating officer, in the same hearing, was asked directly why the original inspection bulletin had been marked closed despite incomplete fleet coverage. His answer, that inspection scheduling had been deprioritized due to budget constraints during a difficult fiscal quarter, and that the closure had been, in his words, an administrative oversight rather than a deliberate misrepresentation, did little to satisfy the committee, and even less to satisfy the traveling public once the transcript became public. Captain Gary Holloway, meanwhile, found himself in a considerably less comfortable position than he could have anticipated the morning he'd made his decision over the interphone. Internal review of the diversion, conducted as standard procedure for any unscheduled landing, surfaced Naomi's full account, cross-referenced against the flight data recorder and Bridget Coyle's original report to Chris Dunbar, an account that, examined closely, revealed a decision built entirely on a flight attendant's vague discomfort rather than any actual safety indicator, a decision that had cost the airline real money and, more damagingly, had removed the one person on that aircraft actively documenting a genuine safety concern. Gary was placed on administrative leave pending review, a review that, 3 months later, resulted in a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining rather than termination. The airline's internal committee ultimately concluding that his underlying instinct to prioritize caution wasn't itself the problem, but the complete absence of any actual investigation before acting on it was. Naomi received a phone call 2 months after the grounding from a woman named Patricia Nkamelu, the newly appointed director of Continental Sky's Safety and Compliance Division, a role created specifically in response to the congressional hearing's recommendations. "Dr. Ferris, I want to start by apologizing directly," Patricia said. "What happened to you on that flight was wrong on every level, and I've read the full internal review. I also want to say that your report likely prevented a catastrophic failure on this fleet. I don't think that gets said to you clearly enough in all of this." "I appreciate that," Naomi said, "though I'd rather it not have taken a diversion and a public embarrassment to get the inspections done properly in the first place." "You're right," Patricia said, "and I want to ask you something directly, if you're open to it. We're building an independent technical advisory board, outside consultants with direct authority to flag concerns without going through internal management first. I'd like you to consider chairing it." Naomi was quiet for a moment, turning the offer over carefully, weighing the particular exhaustion of being asked to fix, from the inside, an institution that had treated her as a threat only months earlier, against the genuine value of the access and authority the role would actually provide. "I'll consider it," she said finally, "on the condition that the board's findings are published publicly, in full, regardless of how uncomfortable they are for the airline to read." "Agreed," Patricia said without hesitation. "That's actually the whole point." Naomi accepted the role 3 weeks later. Under the new advisory structure, 2 additional safety concerns were identified and addressed within the first year alone, neither of which made national headlines, because neither of them was allowed to escalate long enough to require one. Captain Gary Holloway, following his retraining, requested and was granted a transfer to a different route, one that never crossed paths with Naomi again, though he later told a colleague, during a conversation neither of them expected to have, that he'd thought about that morning more than almost any other decision in his 20-year career, and that he'd come to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that the fastest way to feel certain about a threat was very often the least reliable way to actually identify one. That's the story of Flight 1163. Dr. Naomi Ferris was removed from an aircraft for doing her job with more care than anyone around her understood or bothered to ask about. The report that followed her off that flight didn't just clear her name. It kept a fleet of aircraft in the sky safely, instead of finding out the hard way what happens when caution gets pointed at the wrong thing entirely. At 35,000 feet, everyone wears the same seatbelt, but the people who actually keep that seatbelt meaning something are rarely the ones making the most noise about it. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's always another flight, and always someone quietly doing the work that keeps the rest of us safe.